Mac, along with many other sources, may have told you that the origin of the brand was in 1984. However, that's not strictly true, as Makeup Art Cosmetics Limited was actually incorporated in February 1981. However, to tell you the story of its origin, before we dive into the marketing and the positioning that made them famous, I first need to take you back a few years before. This video is largely informed by this book. It was written in conjunction with the University of Toronto. It's not a sponsored video, I should say. The book itself, though, is absolutely phenomenal and features many, many personal stories of the Franks that are not in this video because they're not directly about the company / the business. I'll put an affiliate link for it below, but it is quite expensive. So if you manage to ask your local library to buy it so more people can read it, I do highly recommend it. I just cried so many times reading it. It was absolutely brilliant. So, Frank Angelo arrived in Toronto in 1969 and began a new hairdressing business with his then partner, James. The salon on Schollard Street in Toronto's Yorkville neighborhood was called the Hair Cutting Place. It was wildly successful and within only a year had expanded significantly across Canada into 37 salons, many of which in prime locations, most notably for this story, in an influential department store in Toronto called Simpsons. The reason it was so successful? He pioneered in Toronto a unisex walk-in establishment where customers did not pick their hairdressers, which ended up forcing loyalty onto his business instead of the hairdresser directly, which offered a huge differentiator to their main competitors in Vidal Sassoon, who opened also on Schollard Street in 1969, and House of Lords that opened, I think, on Yonge Street in 1969 as well, both of whom offered a buy hairdresser reservation system. Frank Angelo, even at 21, had now proved that he was a phenomenal business person, always looking for creative people and creative ideas to help reinvent. This would be when Frank Angelo met Frank Toskan in Manatee, which is a gay bar in Toronto, and they soon became romantic partners. Fast forwarding 6 years to 1976, they would begin their first business together. Named Creative Salon Services, it would provide towels for the haircutting place as well as other salons in the area, and then soon into providing capes, hair color, and salon tools for which they would do the washing. This isn't too relevant to the development of Mac, but it was the first time the two Franks would work together and the first time Toskan would provide for Angelo's business. Really, it seemed Angelo had a large effect on Toskan, as from here he began to look for business ideas of his own, but from his more creative perspective. Toskan himself was a photographer and makeup artist after all, and regularly was photographing friends, strippers, and drag queens for his own personal projects, even some of whom would help in the laundering of towels for his creative salon services venture. It was through this effect on Toskan that going back to 1974, so 2 years before Creative Salon Services, he had been taken by Il Makiage makeup in Fiorucci in America, and he had wanted to distribute the makeup in Canada, knowing that their highly pigmented colors would be perfect for the people that he knew in Toronto, which he could sell through the haircutting place. Amazingly, Il Makiage said yes to him as long as he would take the entire line, which you should know included their Avigal shampoo, a direct competitor to the haircutting place's own line of haircare products known as the Hairdresser's Choice. For this reason, it was a hard sell when he got back to Toronto. Not to his lover Angelo, funny enough, but to Simpsons, the department store in which the haircutting place was mainly situated. They pitched it to Rod Ulmer, then the divisional merchandise manager for cosmetics, who was interested, but he thought the colors of Il Makiage were too out there and didn't want to launch it besides their luxury branded cosmetics. Instead, he offered them a rented standalone makeup counter on the second floor, away from Chanel, Dior, the luxury branded cosmetics which were on the first floor, next to the young teens clothing department. It was directly for this space that Toskan would incorporate his business as Makeup Art Cosmetics Limited in February 1981, with the neon sign Makeup Art Center above the door. Though it is noted in the book that he recollects that he was probably doing business in Simpsons a little earlier than this. This iteration of Mac as a store was actively unisex in its promotional material and events, and sold Il Makiage makeup amongst several other professional-grade cosmetics directly to target his friends, so other photographers, makeup artists, and drag queens in the Toronto area. To explain how it looked, I'm going to quote the book directly, as well as show you pictures also from the book. So, quote, "The glass showcase contained product displays, and the hair products were stacked neatly behind the counter. On the counter, single round blush and eyeshadow testers were attached to pyramid-shaped plexiglass units. Lipsticks were stacked in a row in a separate unit. The counter had several chairs for customers who wanted detailed consultations and lessons, as Toskan always offered information and instruction when selling these professional-grade products." Naturally, the store filled a much-needed role in the professional needs of creatives and was wildly successful in the Toronto area, accepting sales of 300,000 Canadian dollars in its first year alone. They were representing very underrepresented people, and this was certainly clear even from the people that they would hire in the store. They purposely hired creative women and men for their retail counters, building that tribe of creative, unisex, underground people right from the get-go. People that may have had trouble getting employment elsewhere, all coming together in a very prideful and fiercely loyal group. A total contrast to the clinical, soulless look of the high-end cosmetics that were on the first floor. Quote, "In the 1980s, the only men who were associated with makeup were the superstars who came to a store from Paris or New York for a special appearance. In New York, men did apply and sell makeup at the beauty counter, but this practice was not yet widespread in Toronto," Toskan recollects. Department stores by nature were highly risk-averse, and management listened intently to any kind of negative customer feedback and took it very seriously. Though interestingly, while he was creating this world within the store, he would purposefully not hire too many makeup artists that had worked on counters before. Other visual makeup artists, yes, but Toskan mostly wanted people who would show up as originally as possible. Tattoos, piercings, wild makeup included, to represent the creative value of the brand in a way that cannot be taught. Quote, "When you went to the MAC counter, you saw individuality and very bold expressionism. They were bigger, smaller, Asian, black, white, boys in makeup. That was unheard of at the time. It was shocking." As such, they really delivered on their makeup for all approach. They had one of the widest foundation ranges available on the market, something that became famed in the local area because theirs was developed most with the consumer in mind, i.e., theirs was the one that didn't make the client look ashy. They were also purposefully matte and full coverage so that performers and models could easily get their colors seen better and last longer, while drag queens could more easily cover their beards. Yes, this is actually stated as a reason for having some of the full coverage products that they stocked in store. So all of this meant that they were a wild success, and eventually by 1982 meant that they were already profitable enough to expand into their own store at 233 Carlton Street in Cabbagetown, Toronto. This offered them true control over the retail space for the first time. Not that they weren't quite liberated in Simpsons, but now the risk of being quelled by the management at the department store was absent. The store was all white with makeup and hair salon on the first floor, offices on the second, and a home for the Franks on the third. And quickly it became a social hub for the creatives of Toronto and somewhere Toskan could continue his photography work with his friends that was then used in promotional material for the haircutting place. In its first year, Toskan sold $20,000 worth of products at the Carlton Street store, which is around 50,000 Canadian dollars today. Interestingly though, that was still all selling other branded products. But that was soon to change. Toskan's younger sister Julie, in 1982, began dating Victor Casali. He was just a high school student at the time, but by 1984, he began studying chemistry at the University of Toronto. Of course, he knew the family by name, but they actually hadn't met until that year of 1984, when Julie brought him home to meet her brother. Somewhat fortuitously, on that meeting, Casali and Julie walked in on Frank mixing a new shampoo for creative salon services to be sold under the Hairdresser's Choice label. Casali allowed Toskan to study his textbooks to find exactly the ingredients he needed for the shampoo, which was with low lather that would rinse out quickly, and together they succeeded. It seems that this was their first actual product developed by the Franks and distributed in Frank Angelo's new hairdressing school as well as to his salons, and the word of mouth from students made it a success. They also made another product named Formula K, which was specifically for black hair textures, which was also wildly successful at the time, and after taking it to trade shows in America, they were able to set up a whole product innovation team to help develop their own products, though actually the Formula K never went as far as they had hoped it would. This timed rather interestingly, as with times changing, the exchange rate between the Canadian and American dollars made Il Makiage too expensive to import, which ended up leading MAC to the opening of the Makeup Arts Center as a product development company. They would manufacture industry-quality products at a fraction of the price and sell them both to industry professionals as well as to the public. In short, MAC had now evolved as a cosmetics manufacturer in 1984. The products themselves, of course, were highly pigmented, and they would focus on a matte finish instead of the 1980s Serge Lutens-famed shimmer, and would be even heavier coverage than Il Makiage was before them, perfect for their existing drag queen clients, and they infused skincare elements like vitamins into the formula to make them genuinely interesting to the general public as well as to other makeup artists. Another large influence was Formula K, something that they had developed for their friend Gladys Knight, which had proved to the Franks how little was on the market for women of color. And so, with that insight, they purposefully developed all colors to suit all skin colors, from eyeshadow to foundation. While for packaging, he knew to improve on the current professional products, he would be best advised to go for something prettier, more elegant, something that they would be proud to carry in their kit. A sleek black container that was congruent to their gender-neutral brand ethos. And in retail, they innovated by selling each color individually, allowing professionals to create their own collections rather than rely on the pre-assembled palettes that were standard at the time. This directly offered them several differentiators, but most importantly allowed their customer to experience makeup in their own creatively free way, directly opposed the very formulaic approach that their most direct competitor, Jean MacDonald Beauty Works, as well as most beauty companies in the 1980s, let's be honest, were pushing. The step following contouring and the trend of matching one's colors to their skin and hair tones, something that's recently come back into fashion. Actually, the Franks were so against the idea of having someone come into the store with their colors that they were actively discouraging them to use these colors that they had paid to have, and instead to buy what made them happy, what made each individual customer feel unique and special. By 1985, they had their first true product innovation, a highly pigmented red lipstick with absolutely no gloss or shine in a true matte. This became called Russian Red and was soon in all of the makeup artists' bags and featured in Madonna's iconic 1990 Vogue music video, though we will come back to this, because for now, quote, MAC's niche was thus established, a makeup line created by a makeup artist for makeup artists that relied on a communicative network based on shared cosmetic practices that were distinctly different in aesthetic, style, and focus. This effectively is how MAC would foundation themselves in many of the first few years. Reactionary, almost custom-made cosmetics for professionals who received a 40% industry discount, by the way, to increase popularity in the professional sector. And they would likely have succeeded in this, becoming something like a Canadian Ben Nye. But their trajectory would soon change in 1987 when they began aligning themselves with corporate responsibility. Now, we've talked a lot about cause marketing on this channel over the last few months, especially in The Body Shop and in my Lush videos, which dissected how brands can use shared ethics to create a tribe of loyal customers and effectively profit off of the ethics that their customers have. MAC was not like this at all. Well, The Body Shop and Lush both actively used activism in promotional materials and made it a core of their businesses in the pursuit of profit. MAC really didn't. Instead, their foray into cause marketing was almost accidental and has many academics questioning whether it's cause marketing at all. You see, this was the 1980s, and obviously it was during the AIDS crisis. By 1987, the Toronto Fashion Council began an event called Fashion Cares, which was a very grassroots, organic, non-corporate / non-institutional event to raise awareness and funds for AIDS aid. The Franks, being that they were both in the queer scene, naturally personally knew many people affected, even their customers were heavily affected. MAC selflessly donated all the makeup for the entire show, and in most, if not all, the makeup artists too were supplied not on the MAC dime, but on the Franks' personal finance. This, of course, was a huge risk. Many designers did not want to be associated with the Fashion Cares show. Enormous stigma was around AIDS at the time, and it was genuinely very brave of the young company to stick their neck out in this way. Nevertheless, they continued this philanthropy every single year following, even, not to skip too far ahead, into the 1990s when in 1994 they became their official sponsor. MAC had always been firmly aligned with the queer community, proudly making cosmetics for drag queens, etc. But this embedded philanthropy into the core identity of the brand for the first time. It was risky, but it communicated the beliefs of the company in a truly authentic manner, creating a loyalty, a tribe amongst their core clientele. It didn't earn them more money. In fact, they probably lost money by doing this, and they weren't really targeting the public, so it wasn't a promotional thing whatsoever. They also didn't promote it themselves past this. MAC didn't have promotional materials in general. It's just this, to them, was the right thing to do. This was not really the beginning of their ethically motivated choices, however. Amongst detailing their then unusual pay structure of a high base salary without commission to dissuade in-store competition, instead encouraging community, they were also cruelty-free from the beginning, something that became truly famous after Madonna was spotted in 1992 in one of their MAC cruelty-free beauty t-shirts, the proceeds of which going to the Johns Hopkins University Institute for Alternative Testing Methods. And the book also touts many packaging decisions that the company took during these years, including making the packaging out of plastic so it was lighter and easier to recycle, and they introduced the Back to MAC program that would give out free lipsticks for each 6 empty packages that were returned, all of which individually dismantled in-house and sent to the appropriate recycling facilities. The book goes on to say that this was innovative for the time and recycling was not a consumer buzzword. Though we know consumer demand was already there for this, the Body Shop expanded there in 1978 and they had a similar programming of refilling bottles, so we know it had been introduced, but MAC was certainly very, very, very early to this. And in comparison to shops like the Body Shop, they actually really didn't promote this whatsoever. So with that said, to the outside consumer, that was not their main selling point. That was really their desirability for high pigment, great quality cosmetics. And yet, much like many businesses, it still wasn't until a celebrity endorsement that MAC would become a household name. Truthfully, celebrities had long known about MAC because they were organic fans from their makeup artist friends. From Linda Evangelista to Naomi Campbell to Cher. Even famously Diana, Princess Diana, asked to keep the MAC products that were used on her for her sitting of the David Bailey portrait, for example. But it was actually in 1988 when Madonna did an interview in which she admitted to wearing MAC's Russian Red, so this was 2 years before the Vogue music video, just for context, from which several department stores and retailers got in touch to carry MAC over in America. They accepted only one to open their first international counter in Henry Bendel in New York, and they were soon top sellers after well translating everything they had set up in Canada, so much so that there were queues outside the door, prompting them to hire 2 electric door men, RuPaul and Lady Bunny, in full drag. Following this success, they expanded into Nordstrom, and by 1988, along with these two, they had 15 points of sale in Canada, including their flagship store. By 1989, total sales were around $10 million when they would have their first scandal. A staff member at one of the Nordstrom locations was fired for wearing makeup. It was obviously Nordstrom's decision, not Mac's, but along with Toskan and singer/customer Linda Ronstadt, it was the customers who protested the firing at a demonstration outside the store, prompting the store to hire him back and changing their policy to be more inclusive. However, this was not the only time that this happened. Toskan fought Nordstrom several times for the rights of his workers to express themselves, even as the Mac counters were expanding across America. Quote, Toskan insisted that he, his artists, and Mac would not compromise to suit corporate dictates, and he threatened to pull the counter out of Nordstrom if it did not hire the staffer back. The store thought Toskan was crazy to pull what was now a $2.5 million counter out of the store over one staff member, but Toskan stated that it was not just about this single incident. This attitude resonated through all of Mac, and capitulating to Nordstrom would damage his personal and professional integrity and compromise Mac's ethos. If Nordstrom did not rehire this employee, they must pull out. Obviously, Toskan got his way, and soon the whole company rewrote its hiring policy to respect their very lucrative concession. Weirdly, it was this that had the public become aware of their very inclusive of LGBTQ+ minorities standpoint. Not anything to do with their philanthropic efforts earlier mentioned, but it did tie that level of freedom really organically across both countries with the brand. Mac stood up for us as oppressed people at a time when so few really did, and that created a fierce loyalty with the brand amongst the people they were truly targeting. This brings us to the eventual Mac logo design by Donald Robertson that established them as a more legitimate, established cosmetics brand in their own right. The logo, now in its third iteration, perfectly explained the Mac perspective. Part of this came with a repositioning that also expanded in 1991 when Mac hired their first marketing assistant, Valerie McKenzie. She first had some smaller tasks just to do with the organic mentions in magazines or editorials, which, given how commonplace their products were in TV shows, music videos, and print, was actually quite a lot, despite their products mostly going unnamed because they still didn't advertise. But they did dabble in shock marketing with their first cause-marketed products, namely these Make Up, Make Out, Play Safe t-shirts in 1991, whose proceeds went to the American organization Design Industries Foundation Fighting AIDS, or DIFA, and to the Canadian AIDS Society, or CAS, which got decent press for these same-sex couples that were making out in the design. But really, the first major product that she would oversee in marketing was Studio Fix in 1992, which novelly worked with undertones as well as skin tones to find a more true match to one's skin, which, considering their audience was still largely POC as other brands dragged their feet into the market, it did exceptionally well, and I would guess is probably still their best-selling product to this day. However, that promotionally was really only small fry in comparison to the launch of the 1992 Viva Glam line. Mid-price to continue their pricing strategy, and based on their best-selling Russian Red, just this time they would tie in the original founding ethics of the brand by donating all proceeds to help fight the stigma of AIDS, something that the company had obviously long been backing, from their t-shirts to the annual donations of makeup and makeup artists to Fashion Cares, which was of course still going on at this time. Viva Glam was a huge risk. AIDS was still massively stigmatized. I mean, it still is today, despite it not being the life-threatening illness that it once was. And so to closely align your most key products to the support of that cause was firstly very brave, but also helped further their overtly pro-LGBTQ+ standpoint that really for customers was just most noticeable in their staff profile. In interviews, the Franks were rarely described as a couple, despite being very obviously together, and stigma around gay people in general was worsening just due to the miseducation around AIDS. So, to openly promote that, quote, "From the sales of this lipstick, every penny, by which he means not just the profits, but 100% of the sales price, goes to AIDS, was unabashed and very transparent. MAC covered every cost of this product. From R&D to production to distribution, they even included a free condom in early sales and demanded the department stores not take a percentage as well. And the fact that they had made it as their most well-considered product ever meant that regardless, everybody would want it, maximizing the possibility of sales. Obviously, the lipstick was massively controversial. People just didn't understand AIDS. How were they ever going to understand a company sticking their neck out in this way for the, quote, gay disease, as it was known then? But it did its job. This lipstick really wasn't meant to make any money. In fact, they actively lost money on every sale. But its goal was to raise awareness and education. And it very much succeeded in that. Really, it's for this reason why it's debated if this is a cause-marketed product at all. They never intended to make any money through a performative use of cause marketing, and instead, they ended up losing money on every single sale because they believed in the message. And they never stopped at this either. By late 1992, they went on a Canadian fundraising tour with the lipstick, losing money along the way. And by January 1993, the sales, and therefore donations, totaled $100,000. Not long after, the total soon was touted as 300,000 Canadian dollars by David Livingstone in the Globe and Mail. By 1995, just after MAC had been taken over majority sponsorship of the aforementioned Fashion Cares show in Toronto in 1994, becoming the single largest donator in Canadian corporate history to help fight AIDS to the tune of 125,000 Canadian dollars, then newly naming it the MAC Viva Glam Fashion Cares show, and setting up their own AIDS charity, the MAC AIDS Fund, also in 1994, they would produce their very first ad campaign ever for Viva Glam in 1995. Obviously, this was not their first promotional material. We've gone over several that they paid for or donated for thus far, including the Fashion Cares show. And even in the same year, though not at the same event, they even had their own actual catwalk show at the Festival of Canadian Fashion, which was open to the public and was explicitly commercial, unlike the Fashion Cares show. But this Viva Glam campaign was on a much larger, much less local scale, though like everything, Viva Glam thus far was paid for out of the pockets of the Franks, not through the company. So they really needed the perfect person to be the face of their new line. But it was a success. Quote, RuPaul's glamorous and extraordinary appearance and performances made him a natural choice for MAC, said Toskan, who said at the time that he had long considered using a man to represent MAC. Quote, we couldn't find anyone who wore makeup and had so much fun doing it. I've always thought it would be impossible to put a face to MAC because of what we stand for. All sexes, all races, all ages. But RuPaul is male, he's female, and he's ageless. He fits the bill. It was also very important for this new face to be well versed in AIDS activism, which Ru was already heavily invested in personally, and to have the impact needed for their first ever ad campaign. Again, something that RuPaul could bring because he was a drag queen, because he was so gorgeous and tall. However, while this was having the incredible impact to raise awareness of the brand and their messaging, another problem had arisen. While for a long time MAC was the only professional makeup available to the public in this accessible way, several competitors had newly popped up. There was NARS, Trish McEvoy, and Bobbi Brown, who all had their own, unfortunately a little similar, brands. And because their business size was much smaller and not tied to a loss-making product, and also not riddled by fake products in the Asian market, we'll come back to that, they were more agile to respond to new customer demands. This was pretty much when MAC had to turn to Estee Lauder. Competition was ramping up, and it was clear that they would need funds in order to fight this. However, they couldn't put their corporate finance here when given the sheer size of counterfeiters in Asia, which was a market they had yet to enter, where they were, quote, given only 1 year by various levels of government to set up MAC legally in Asia. If they did not succeed, the Franks would lose all rights to the MAC trademark in these Asian countries. the clock was really ticking. They were at real risk of losing their business if any of these copycats were to get big enough to expand, and even on home shores, if any of these new competitors got big enough to take over while they were focused on the Asian market. So they turned to the one investor that back in 1989 had already expressed interest: Estee Lauder. Quote, the Franks and Leonard Lauder had an immediate connection and an excellent professional and personal working relationship right from the start. Estee Lauder had operated in Asia for years. Its distribution networks could start shipping MAC overseas almost immediately, and MAC clearly needed Estee Lauder to help them get MAC legally into the Asian market. Lauder responded to the Franks' call with an offer: a partnership between Estee Lauder and the Canadian company. The Franks agreed this was the best solution. In December 1994, the Estee Lauder Companies Inc. bought 51% of MAC for $38 million. MAC was Lauder's first acquisition of a competitor. Fortunately, at this time, Estee Lauder kept MAC pretty much the same. They didn't touch the brand identity, the branding, they didn't even touch the MAC AIDS fund. All of that was still going as if nothing had ever changed. They understood MAC had a very unique value proposition and didn't want to change that. But unusually, anticipating backlash for the sale, they promoted only that this was a partnership and purposely kept the true nature of the deal rather hush-hush. Over the course of the 90s, more and more was purchased by Estee Lauder, and by 1998, they owned 100% of MAC. Then, following Frank Angelo's much unexpected and unfortunate death in 1997, the remaining Frank Toskan left the company. The sale had never gone down well with staff or devotees, and the way that it was revealed in the October 1995 IPO of Estee Lauder felt dishonest, or as if the brand was selling out now that Frank Angelo had unfortunately passed away. So a part of me just wonders if they had been as transparent about the sale as they had been with everything else, if it was evident that right from the very beginning of the sale in 1994 that Estee Lauder didn't want to change anything. I wonder if people would have understood the choice of the acquisition, as so rarely do we see an acquisition happen and things not change. I wonder if it would have restored some kind of hope in their original customer. Nevertheless, under Estee Lauder, MAC had the finances that they needed to expand greatly but carefully. They expanded into Asia as planned in 1995, as well as expanded across Europe. They did have one store on Carnaby Street which opened in 1993, but Estee Lauder really expanded on this. And even they would continue promoting their Viva Glam line in queer spaces, most notably in the first season of RuPaul's Drag Race in 2009, in this episode that absolutely always makes me cry. MAC was on top of the world throughout this time. Their sales grew year on year at absolutely astonishing rates, and the feel of the brand was largely untainted by the acquisition. However, that brings me really onto the fall of MAC, because inherently there really isn't a fall. Yes, their style isn't really in style at the moment, but under a large parent company, they have methods of allowing that to happen so that their brands can maintain integrity. You see, under a parent company as big as Estee Lauder, who owns all of these brands currently, all acquired after MAC, there is usually a balancing act going on. So I'm going to use the BCG graph to illustrate this. So Estee Lauder will have had a couple of star brands, maybe a couple of cash cow legacy brands, which make the money that allows the other brands that have been on the market a while time to have a bit of a lull before they can either be relaunched or just brought back with savvy marketing. Some of them are meant to make money and some of them are meant to wait. This freedom of time is so important for brands because it allows the company time to reinvent when appropriate, as opposed to being forced to change to go along with trends, which risks losing the individual brand identity, which then of course would be a big problem for the parent company. You need both, and they need to be able to be switched over time on the long term. However, the problem that Estee Lauder seemed to be having was that because they were buying hype brands at the time, people like Too Faced, Tom Ford, Smashbox, Dr. Jaretsu, they didn't have that balance. They were all up, making sales, expanding, and then they were all down together. Now, MAC has turned into a cash cow, which is seen on the graph, and they do have some star products still today. They have the Ordinary, Kilian, Le Labo, Erin. However, because it's not as star-powered as they once were, it does mean that sales lowered from what they were in the past, and it seems that Estee Lauder have had trouble keeping the stock prices high as sales have continued on a downward trend. This in the end, over time, has caused them to take some measures like reducing staff, etc. But fortunately, because they do have stable cash cows like Clinique, Jo Malone, Frederic Malle, even MAC is pretty steady, so their sales are at least enough, they're at least steady, their audiences are locked in at this point, so luckily I don't think the company is going to fold at any time soon. This is not about that. But what it is to say is that the reason that MAC looks like it's in a fall is because they are in their tactical lull, waiting for more creative makeup to come back into fashion. However, because their parent company is also in a tricky spot because of the other acquired brands, it looks far worse than it is. MAC might not be as popular as it once was, and it's not really there for the people that are following the hottest brand of the season because of that. However, the more important thing is that MAC hasn't lost its true identity. Yes, there's been a few formula changes along the way, and yes, they have discontinued some fan-favorite products. Of course they have over time as things get less popular. Plus, they also really heavily expanded on the MAC Viva Glam advertising campaigns to include all of the many mainstream celebrities that have now had a MAC Viva Glam lipstick or a campaign, which I don't think can be argued as not ethical marketing anymore. But in all of this, MAC has really never lost that core identity of who the brand is. MAC still are who they have always been. They are good quality makeup for creative professionals. They still have that niche. Especially amongst the queer community, they are still a go-to for ultra-pigmented products. In fact, when I asked famed London designer Charles Jeffrey from Charles Jeffrey Loverboy his perspective on this, he said, "I do still use MAC cosmetics and I have a large amount of it because they do sponsor me for my fashion shows and therefore give me a lot of product whenever I need it. And for me, I just love the variation of products that they have, and they allow me to create a lot of weird, wonderful things, and the formulations are tried and tested. They have always championed things like gay rights, and they have always been so supportive of me, and so I'm hoping my relationship continues to bloom with them." This evidences a few things. One, that MAC is still supportive of the creative arts quite heavily, especially Charles Jeffrey is also very largely influenced by the club kids scene, so it's very true to their drag origins. Number two, that they are still respected for their incredible pigmented formulas. Number three, that they are still popular with creative people in the fashion industry like makeup artists, like fashion designers. And number four, that their fiercely pro-LGBTQ stance is still influential to their popularity as a brand. So, just because they're not the public's buzzworthy name in vogue right now, or because they're not following influencer trends, does not inherently mean that the company is doing badly. Their social media is bad, I will admit that. It doesn't communicate the true creativity of the brand, and according to this paper by Sun and Shu, it really affects the way that their consumers are engaging with the brand. They say that for factors of purchase, the quality was at 72.73%, while the brand desirability and reviews were all the way down at 42.42%, which is really quite a disparate percentage and goes to explain why they still have a good cult following. They are that cash cow brand, but in a wider sense, they're just not seen as popular, which the paper does point out is probably because of their lacking social media and the fact that they don't use anything like influencers using their makeup products to show how they could be used. But with that said, just because they aren't following trends or because they're not using influencers or creators, that doesn't necessarily mean that the company is doing badly. Because if what I suspect is true, that they're in this tactical lull, this could be purposeful as to not draw too much attention and be a bit cringy before super creative makeup comes back. From my perspective, MAC has not lost their most valuable commodity, which is their identity. And so unlike, say, KVD, they haven't alienated their core clientele. I told you before, but I used to be a club kid in London, and I can confidently say that I still use their products, as do very many of my drag/underground scene friends, even if it is a bit secretly, since MAC is no longer cruelty-free since around 2012. Really, their products are still phenomenal, and their pigments are the best, plus few brands have represented the queer community in the genuine manner that they have over the decades. Is there new competition from brands like Issamaya French? Yes, but MAC is still a firm favorite for professionals. They are still that stable, reliable brand that made them popular all those years ago with professionals. Nowadays, my hope for the brand is that when creative makeup comes back into fashion, and I'm sure it's probably not in the not too distant future, they don't miss the boat. Competition is going to be fierce when that time comes. There are brands like Issamaya French and House Labs who are already poised to become the dominant creative brand when that style of makeup does come back. And honestly, if MAC doesn't up their game with social media when this change happens, if they don't time it right, despite their large size, that's a very easy way for these smaller brands to take over, and to me seems like a great weakness in the brand right now. So, although it seems from their heritage that they are in the best position to dominate, you can never really know in cosmetics if they will be as well welcomed back as they deserve. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please do like and subscribe to this channel. For videos just like this but about fashion brands, please do check out Understitch, which is my fashion channel linked here, and a special thank you goes over to my patrons over on Patreon, some of whose names are on the screen now. All content used in this video is done so in accordance with the principles of fair use. However, if you have any concerns, please contact me directly at contact@understitch.co.uk.